everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I'm Katie, joined by Chris and John. Hey guys, how's it going? Over here.
It's
Not over
going.
here.
It's the
Excellent.
time in December is flying by.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, I think we have basically another full week and a half before we can expect anyone to kind of get back to us and help us be productive. And that's about it.
If that.
Um, I was actually going to start keeping a tally of how many times either I said or someone else said, let's revisit that in the new year. Because I feel like that's where we're at now. Well, anyway, so we are going to be productive today. So on today's show, we are covering top news and web stories. So we're going to look at how much content is being produced for the web, how to use SEO tools to measure the effectiveness, and how AI tools play a role in top news and web stories. And so if you weren't aware, every year Chris puts out the 12 days of data. And he starts on December 1st and he goes through, 12 days going through various topics. And one of the topics, Chris, that you always cover is how much content is being produced in the form of top news and web stories. So where would you like to start today?
I think we should probably start off with talking a bit about the data sources, because depending on your perspective, you get very different numbers and very different types of what constitutes news. So what constitutes news, Katie?
I think that's the question, because it's going to be a different answer for everyone. If we can ask John the same question. But for me, it's information about what's happening in the areas that I care about. And so I would love to say that I care a little bit more about what's going on politically. I think I'm just kind of burnt out. So I don't check those particular stories as often as maybe somebody else would. But I do tend to care more about what's going on with the environment and climate change and, things related to health and seasonality. So for me, those are news stories. It should be articles that, present information about current affairs, essentially. John, what's news to you?
Yeah, that's a great, this is one of those things we really need a journalist on here to explain this, because no matter how, as a layman, you try to, explain it, the journalists have a better view of this. I mean, it's really recording history, right? It's recording what is happening around us at the time. And then the challenge, though, that you have is there's just an infinite assortment of topics that people are interested in, right? There's a whole gigantic industry of sports journalism, which I just don't have any time for. I mean, it's not that I don't like it or don't care, but that's not anything I'm looking at today, but there's plenty over there. So yeah, the thing that gets me the most is, it's generating content about what's going on in the world. And with all of the tools we have now, it just seems to be exploding at an exponential rate. And so that's why I'm always excited to see what happens with this, because we have had, I don't know, over the past few years, there were a couple years where it finally did trend down, where the automated stuff had the dial turned back on it a little bit. And I think we had just reached such saturation that all of the spam tools were no longer doing anything good. But now we're entering a next generation of stuff with AI writing much better copy. So we may be stepping on the gas again. It may be going from absolutely horrible to even worse than that. But I'm excited to see what the numbers show here.
So from a technological perspective, news is who your data providers say news is, right? Which is a thoroughly unsatisfying answer. But when, as a marketer, if you're trying to figure out what constitutes news, it's who the data provider says news is. So let me give you a couple of examples. We're going to go first to Google's GDELT database. So for those who are unfamiliar, GDELT is an open source project. You go to gdelt.org. This is a global database of news powered by Google Jigsaw, the contents of which are a substantial portion of what is in Google News, right? So the GDELT database is this gigantic, huge database ingesting news in real time from all over the world. And as with so many different news, sources, it's based mostly on URLs. Like these, for example, CNN.com would be a newsworthy domain. some dude's blogspot.com blog, not a news domain. And so from that perspective, news is essentially who Google says news is. And this varies from provider to provider. So let me show you another example from the Ahrefs software. Ahrefs is SEO software. I put in a search for stop words, like basic stop words, a or and or the, because that's the easiest way to scoop up essentially the entire database. In 2022, according to Ahrefs, there have been 489 million pages published this year that are in some way notable. But they added a button this year saying, let's focus on news. And now this slims down to about 65 million pages. So for them, they think there's about 65 million pages of news in this year. If we go to the GDELT database, we run the same query. I want to count the number of URLs where the publication date was this year. You get about 53.6 million URLs, which is about, it's about a 16% difference between the two. And when you quickly inspect the data to see like what's in there, the data varies. The URLs vary, but you do see, I would say more traditional accredited news sources, I think would be the best way to put it, in the GDELT database, whereas the Ahrefs database tends to be a little bit more, a little bit less restricted. It's not entirely, but you see some things here like, Microsoft Documents, right, for the Microsoft documentation website. I would not personally call that a news source, right? Even though that is technically news, like this is what's changed. So that's the first and probably the most difficult place to start is what constitutes news. For the 12 days of data, when we look at what constitutes news, we used to use the Ahrefs database, and then 3 years ago, we'd switched over to the GDELT database as the source of news-like things, partly because it scales better and it's easy to work with, and partly because they do have a lot of interesting features in there that you don't get out of an SEO tool.
Such as?
There's a system of encoding news events called Cameo. Cameo stands for Conflict and Mediation Event Observations, created by by Penn State University. This is a way for news organizations to encode what kinds of news stories there are. Right, so there's all sorts of things, meetings and armed invasions, you name it. And this encoding combined with Google's assessment of the news, they rate news in the GDELT database based on what's called the Goldstein scale. The Goldstein scale is a number between -10 and +10 of how impactful a piece of news is. -10 means negative global consequences, right? Example: Russia invades Ukraine, right? That's a pretty substantial negative impact piece of news. Some dope parks a ship in the Suez Canal the wrong way and blocks international trade for 14 days. That event would be a -10 on the Goldstein scale. On a +10 scale would be the rollout of an mRNA vaccine for COVID, right? It's going to have a strong positive effect. And then 0 in the middle of the scale means it has no impact, right? We put out a press release announcing that Chris cleaned his desk. That's a 0.
That's a 10. If you've ever seen Chris's desk and it gets cleaned and perhaps disinfected, that's a 10. Anyway, all right, so let's say I'm following these codes. Who is deciding what's a -10 and what's a +10?
Google. And we don't know how.
And that I take issue with because, as we've discussed in previous episodes, if it's, if they're using some sort of automation or AI to code based on the words that are written or, databases that have been trained and those kinds of things, we know that there's bias introduced into those things. And so, the way that I feel about, as a terrible example, the way that I feel about a Russian invasion might be on a different, like I might see it as a -2, whereas John might see it as like a -4 and Chris sees it as a -10. And yet somehow all of that is supposed to be, telling us what is good and what's bad. Like, I take issue with that.
And therein lies the challenge with which is probably a separate show
I
entirely
think so. Yeah.
about how AI is an intermediary between ourselves and reality. Recommendation engines are literally telling us what to see and read and watch and listen to. And it may not necessarily be conscious decisions on our part anymore. So these codes are all inside the GDELT database. And among other things, let's talk about some of the data you get in here, because I think that itself is useful. All of these tables provide lovely schemas that explain what's involved. You get the date the news was published, of course. And generally speaking, in the encoding of the data, there are actors. So you have actor 1 and all the encoding about it, actor 2 and all the encoding about it. So for example, when Russia invades Ukraine, right? Russia, it would be actor 1 as a nation state, and actor 2 would be Ukraine. And you would see all that data in there. You have the event code based on those cameo lists of what kind of event is it. And then you'd have things like the Goldstein scale. How important is it? How many times within the first 15 minutes of that event occurring was it mentioned? How many sources mentioned it? How many articles mentioned it? What was the sentiment, the tone of that? And more data about the actors and the geographies. And all of this is put in these lovely tables. Now, here's the part where I think for anyone who's an aspiring data scientist, or for anyone who's just curious and likes to poke around, one of the wonderful things about the GDELT system is that it is completely and totally free of cost. Anyone, as long as you can use Google Cloud and you know how to use BigQuery, can go in, work with the data in the database, or export it and put it into your own software, totally free of cost, paid for by Google and the GDELT Foundation. And it's one of like 300 free data sets that Google offers, which I think is pretty cool. So if when you compare that to, say, SEO software, not free, and there are some pretty strict quotas, pretty strict limits on how much data you can export from the systems, depending on the plan that you're paying for. In Ahrefs, I think you have to have like the Pro, Premium, Platinum, Ultra plan or whatever to download millions of records. Otherwise, you're limited to, I think, 250,000 records per month, which, when you're dealing with tens of millions of news stories a year, you run out of runway real fast. That was one of the other reasons we moved to the GDELT database when we're doing our 12 days of data, was except for the processing cost, if you make a copy of it, you can work with this data for free.
Gotcha. That is interesting, because you don't often see data sets that big, just like, and here we are with documentation, by the way.
With documentation, schemas, and it's in real time. I think there's a 15-minute lag between when a piece of news appears on the wire and when it shows up in the GDELT database. We have actually spoken to clients in the past recommending that, in addition to their regular media monitoring, they may want to, search for URLs, mentioning brand names. It might not be the worst idea in the world to have that, a simple monitor set up in there. So that's the data sources where we get this information. The next part is, what do you do with it?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it depends on your level of skill. There is no friendly interface to this software at all. It's just a SQL database. The GDELT project does offer some basic UI stuff if you want to try and mess around on their site, but it does not scale particularly well. They mostly recommend, hey, you should probably go and write some code, which is not super helpful. So if you have skills with SQL, the SQL query language, you can just edit straight in the database. Oh, that's the wrong query. You can't just do your edits straight in the database. Like when I was counting the number of news stories, I said, show me the number of URLs in the database for this year. Very straightforward SQL queries.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's up to you then to decide how you want to work with that data and process it. We do it with, unsurprisingly, the R programming language. So we take, in this case, we take the data out of the GDELT database, which takes a lot of effort. And then we format it we process it and format it into essentially some reasonably nice looking charts and graphs, which is substantially easier. So, for example, this year we took the Goldstein codes, the ones that were marked either -10 or plus 10, and said, what categories were they? And the use of conventional military force and fighting with small arms and light weapons. Those were predominantly around two big events. One was the invasion of Ukraine, and the other was the ongoing genocide in Ethiopia. And between those two, that comprised the majority of the serious events this year, the things either -10 or +10. And you see a few other things. When we look at the general events, right, you get a lot more variety, right? You know, made a statement, made an appeal request, made a visit, praised or endorsed, hosted a visit, consulted, express intent to cooperate, had a meeting, right? These codes are a lot more varied, but they allow us to see, you know, more of what the news was. Even still, there's still a lot of armed conflict and things. 2022 was a very violent year.
Mhm. So, for the purposes of this exercise, what you are trying to establish is how much more news was published than previous years. If I'm not trying to establish that, what are some other use cases for this kind of data?
It depends on what the purpose would be. One thing that we've used this for, and this is actually subject to the next 2 days worth of 12 days of data, is because the source URLs are built into the GDELT system, you can actually narrow down specific kinds of news. One of the ones that is, you know, my personal favorite is identifying press releases. Right, press releases from like Business Wire and so on and so forth. We can extract and count the number of those things per domain. So this year in 2022, as of last night, we've done 297,000 press releases this year, which is down a little from 2021, still up from 2020. And you know, we're only 8 days into December, so we still got we still got time for marketers and communicators to issue a couple tens of thousands more press releases.
Things that they're pleased to announce.
Exactly, things are pleased to announce. And so, if there's specific types of news that you're looking for, or specific publications, and you want to dig in and see just what's the volume of that publication, this database is, if it's in there, is very helpful. So I could say, let's see, and source URL like CNN.com. And let's go ahead and run this.
Now, I know that you said that GDELT scales better for what you're looking for, but if I was just looking purely to count the number of press releases or something that contained the word press release, could I go back to my SEO tool to do that kind of work?
It depends on how good the tool is. A lot of the SEO tools do very basic filtering, and they don't allow you to do very elaborate queries.
But what if it's not an elaborate query? What if I just want to literally find how many press releases, like press release?
That's an elaborate query. I'll show you why.
Yes, please do.
This is what the query looks like to identify a press release. It selects your count from the table, and then these are all the different URL conditions you'd want to identify, domains, and then certain types of words like, you know, for immediate release and so on and so forth within the URLs so that you can export them out. And this is something that an SEO tool is going to really struggle with, because most tools don't focus on press releases.
Even though it's technically a piece of content, though.
Exactly. They're out there, but there's a lot of different news wire services. One of the things we have to do every year when we do this stuff is check, you know, do a quick bit of Googling. Have there been any new press release companies that have, you know, come onto the scene this year? And then we add them to our queries.
You know, it's just amazing to me that with this whole database, you could easily do a front end of completely customized news, right? You could say like, here's the 35 topics I want, and then filter out everything, below a 7 in either direction. And you could have completely tailored to you news. But because we're clickbait driven, like nobody cares.
That's true. I mean, and again, there is still the limiting factor of what constitutes news,
Mhm.
right? Your site may not be in here, even if you may have a very trustworthy publication that is not in here, or is very difficult to identify. For example, I read Dr. Jeremy Faust's Inside Medicine bulletin. He is a Harvard-trained physician. He is, one of the top experts in infectious disease, and he writes on Substack. Let's see if Substack is in here.
Well, I mean, and this goes back to the question of what is news. Like, so for you, that is a source of news for you. I could start publishing to my website every day, like how many cookies I did or didn't eat. That's news, technically, but
It
I
is.
don't think it needs to be in there.
Yep. And there's very few pages from the Substack domain in here, so I'm pretty sure his is not in there. Given that there are thousands of Substack newsletters, including my own, right? I have my lunchtime pandemic newsletter is in there. That is a roundup of news. Is a credible news source? I mean, no, I don't think so. and I say that because I'm a marketing guy and a data analytics guy putting together a COVID newsletter. I am in no way, shape, or form a qualified healthcare practitioner. You should not be taking medical advice from me for any reason whatsoever. But I try to share stuff that you could go ask a qualified healthcare practitioner. Hey, is this a good idea for me to do? I mean, beyond the obvious, like, hey, you should probably wear a mask because filtration of air is important. But in this database, when we did the CNN one had 117,000 pages in here, right? Substack has 620. Are those both valid news sources? It depends. And therein lies the challenge. So from a marketing perspective, you can zoom in on specific data sources and you can get a sense of what data is available about those news sources to help you gauge sort of its importance and how a system like Google sees it, which again is one of those things that you don't really get the inside scoop from the front end of Google News. You don't have any indication. Let's take a look at, let's do select star from that Substack one.
I would imagine another use case for this kind of query would be research in a way. So, for example, if you are trying to write a press release or trying to write an article about something, theoretically, you want to know how many times this topic has already been covered and what's been said about it so that you're not just regurgitating the same information. Like, could you use this to try to figure out a different angle on something that's been covered to death?
Possibly, but the one thing the GDELT database does not include is the actual content. You get the URLs, but you don't get the text of the content itself, at least not in the events table. It might actually be in a different table, in which case you'd have to do a join on it and extract that out. Let's see what we got here. We have from Substack, we have only a couple of newsletters that are in there, but the fields that we're looking for are the number of mentions, the number of sources, and the number of articles. So as we talked about at the beginning, number of mentions is the number of times this article, this URL, was referenced within the first 15 minutes of its publication. The number of sources is the places that cited, and the number of articles, the number of articles that this article appeared in within the first 15 minutes of publication. So from an impact perspective, again, you can see for a specific publication how Google kind of sees the weight of that news.
So in terms of, if we go back to our original topic, which is top news and web stories, what metrics would I be looking at to determine this is a top news story? Like the number of times it was shared, the number of times it appeared, what are the metrics that, because there's a lot of data here. Where do I
There's
want
a
to
lot of data here.
where do I want to
the
specifically focus?
the two I would pick would be the number of mentions that a
Mhm.
piece of news gets. I think is probably your first piece that's important. And the second is the Goldstein scale, which is how impactful does a system like Google think this news is, right? Because you can get a lot of mentions on a story that might not necessarily be super impactful
Mhm.
to the world, that might be consequential. For example, um, Taylor Swift's tickets were selling out, right? It was very difficult to get Taylor Swift tickets. There was a lot of mentions of it. But in the grand scheme of things, and please don't kill me, in the grand scheme of things, I don't know that that is world impacting news, a way that's I think it's going to have massive consequences on society.
Mhm. I would agree with you. I'll support you on that one, Chris.
So having those two numbers, your number of mentions and your Goldstein scale, I think are good starting benchmarks. The
Mhm.
other thing that you might want to do is bring data from GDELT into a custom system of some kind so that you can actually read the article text and process it, right? So you could get some data on that. And then if you really want to get ambitious, if you have the bandwidth and the budget to do so, if you're also getting data out of your SEO tools, you could
Mhm.
cross-reference them and see the big stories from one source, the big stories from another source. The SEO tool is going to have different metrics, right? Your SEO tool is going to have things like page traffic and traffic value and
Mhm.
domain authority that you can cross-reference your news with and say, okay, are these two things the same? Are these two things equally relevant?
I would also, so as you're talking about this, I could imagine, a PR firm who puts out, news and articles all the time on behalf of their clients, using methodology like this to see where the stuff that they put out stands against everything else. Like, how good did we do this year of making sure that the information we're publishing is newsworthy, is relevant? And I feel like that if I were, in charge of an agency like that, I would want to know that information. Like, I'm paying all of this money to get this news out there, but is it just getting buried in the noise compared to everything else? And obviously, you'd have to put it in context of similar topics. Like, if you're putting out that, Trust Insights, Katie and Chris swapped their roles against, the war in Ukraine, yeah, I would expect that our news probably wouldn't be that important. But if you look at it in the scheme of, tech startups, for example, maybe I would want to know that it's a little bit more newsworthy.
Exactly. News like politics is all local. And you can see here just from like some of the top performing news stories in the Ahrefs database, a lot of these are not news that would necessarily be relevant to us, like the winning lottery numbers in a certain part of India, right? That was
Hmm.
a big story, 5.2 million visits to that page. Um, is that a story that is that a piece of news that would be impactful to what we do? Probably not. So that's the other consideration with news. And to your point, Katie, you might want to be a little more focused about which news you pay attention to. One of the things that, again, you can do with either of these tools, it's easier to do with GDELT, that we saw first popularized by our friend Justin Levy back when he was working at Citrix, was paying attention to share of voice, which
Hmm.
generally we hate as a measure because it's a stupid measure in aggregate. But within the innovation he put together that I thought was a brilliant twist was paying attention to your share of voice within a specific set of publications, right?
Hmm.
If you are in an industry and there's 10 newspapers and magazines that cover, virtualization software or 10 bloggers or something like that, using these tools, you could then, where'd John go?
He'll be
Oh,
back.
John. Um, you could use these tools to say, okay, I want to just focus on those 10 publications
Hmm.
and then find, how much presence do we have within that subset. Again, these tools be, plus some of the data, your custom tooling to extract the data would be a very useful way of applying this technology.
Which is essentially what I was getting at. So, I mean, I think that, Justin's smarter than me. So that makes a lot of sense.
The other thing that, and this kind of goes back to where we were talking about at the beginning of the show, is a lot of these publications are pretty well vetted. And so should we expect to see a massive explosion of content from AI? Not necessarily. I mean, some publications probably will be experimenting more with, more first drafts and more trivial content generated by machine. But for the most part, a lot of the content explosion is happening on non-news sites, right? If we put up more blog posts, some machine written blog posts and things on our site, we're not an accredited news source. So that's probably not it's going to be impactful to the amount of news detected here. It will show up in the SEO tools, right? Particularly for just web content in general. You're going to see a lot more content in the SEO tools because there's so much more publishing. One thing that you may want to think about as an organization is, have you tried, and it's a long, slow process, but have you tried applying to become a registered news source? If in fact your blog or your website or whatever is in fact news, you would do this. Interestingly enough, you normally do this in Google Search Console. Search Console is where you would identify, am I a news source to begin with, and then there is an application process for you to be able to go in and say like, yes, here's how the news works.
So to go back to the AI piece, John, you had started to bring up a little bit about, how AI is going to impact the amount of content being created. Have you been, so in the past week, so as we're recording this, it's mid-December 2022. In the past week, there have been a lot of AI tools front and center that are doing a really good job of writing content based on prompts. Have you played with any of this, John? Do you think that it will change how you are creating some of your content?
No, I haven't dug into any of this really, because it's, it seems like it's great for the kind of stuff you do at the corporate level. If you basically I need 35 101 articles on a specific topic or a specific area, it's great for generating a new take on stuff that already exists. And it'll be interesting. There's definitely a dividing line between, it's very easy to do all of that ongoing content stuff versus news, and I know there's already some news generation AI stuff for sporting events. There's whole leagues of baseball where there's no human that does the reporting. They just feed the box scores into the machine and it spits back a story based on what it can do. So it's going to be interesting to see how fast this stuff can scale to a more newsworthy approach, and how does that get managed? I would love to think that there's some real-time editing going on, and at least some kind of proofing. But we also know that as we saw during the blog explosion, that there's plenty of people that are just going to post and look and review later.
The sports piece of it is interesting because you're right. It's here's the scores, here's what happened, and then the AI takes it and writes up whatever the news story is. So, to your point, John, it sounds like AI is starting to play a larger role in news, just that particular segment of news. Maybe not political news or other news. I mean, who knows? It might be. So this is where I would turn to Chris to say, what don't John and I know about where AI is in writing the news?
People have not seen really what the newest language models are capable of and what the next generation ones will be capable of. They are so much better now than they even were 6 months ago in terms of their capabilities. For example, this is the DaVinci 3 model. It's part of GPT-3, which is OpenAI's product. And I put together this prompt. This is a very complex prompt. Write a press release about us, right? And these facts here. Let's put this one more thing. The Trust Insights URL is trustinsights.ai. And I would say, I want you to write me a press release about this thing. This is, again, it's a very detailed prompt. There's a lot of extra stuff in here that you don't normally think of. And what you get is a decently written press release. Now, there's some things here that are factually incorrect, right? There's the Trust Insights CEO. That's incorrect. So
I was going to say, who the heck is John Smith, and when was I getting replaced?
That's Smith.
And so let's take that out. But we can see like this prompt is essentially more or less kind of like factual coding.
But I would, and
Right.
it's funny, as you're doing this prompt, you're taking the time to write all of these facts. Wouldn't it just be the same as you actually just writing the press release, because you just listed everything that the AI is going to regurgitate back to you?
It is, but this is a lot easier because a good chunk of it is going to be templated in ways that are going to be incorporated uniquely within the output that you wouldn't just get from writing it yourself. I mean, you absolutely could write it yourself, but think about this: by varying a few of the facts and then feeding this in not just through the web interface but through the actual API, you could generate 1,000 of these, 2,000 of these in about the same amount of time.
And I'm sure that this is probably a conversation to have later, but we have a new product. Did you make that up for the sake of this?
This is totally made up.
Okay. I was like, wait a minute, what don't I know? Not only am I being replaced, and we have new products.
This is a bit of tongue-in-cheek fun. Artificial intelligence is machine-based. Natural intelligence is humans.
So
your brain has 330 trillion neurons, right? So that is the largest neural network platform ever deployed, which is true. Technically true. And now it's gotten those facts correct, right? Now we've used this. We were doing this in analytics for marketers, writing song lyrics and poems about Google Analytics 4, writing rap lyrics, and the underlying model is extremely powerful and very, very flexible in ways that people do not fully understand the capabilities of these tools. And this is a generation sort of 3.5 of this particular model. While the generation 4 model will be out sometime next year. And this is untrained, right? So this is the big generic model. There are ways for organizations to fine tune this, to say, I want to feed in all of our existing blog content, or I could feed in all of the transcripts from Marketing Over Coffee. And that would add weight to have the output sound more like the kinds of things that your content you've already generated, making it very difficult to distinguish. So from a news perspective, if you wanted to capture the tone of CNN to make your own news site, you could absolutely fine tune a model like this and say, okay, I want to train it on the way CNN publishes stuff and put it in here, or Scientific American or Fox News, or whatever the news source you want. From GDELT, the GDELT database we saw, you with some code, you could extract that data and then use that to fine tune these models.
All right, so John, let's start placing bets on how long before news is 100% AI written and people aren't needed anymore. Or rather, how long before John decides to upload all of the old Marketing Over Coffee transcripts and have the AI pretend to be John and Chris for a few episodes?
Yeah, it's the thing with all this is it's always built on existing stuff. I mean, there's no exploration of the frontier. The thing where it's amazing for is here in code, being able to validate code and fix bugs. As be able to do pair programming without a second person, or in research. If there's just research where you can determine how to do an experiment, to be able to have a machine run 50 billion different variations on a single thing, that's amazing there. But as far as I don't see it doing a lot of creative writing on current topics. That's going to be a challenge. I mean, you can't see how it would work here, though. If you basically just put the key story points in there, you would be able to bang out an article. Plus, I think another angle of that is to be able to bang it out in 25 languages all at the same time. That's now you're talking about something pretty interesting, pretty quick.
And what's interesting about this is, and this is is already a problem. We're already seeing this happening online, but we're seeing it happen with very unsophisticated tools. Is as the language models evolve, you can do a lot of things with them that are ethically questionable, right? Or just outright illegal. So let's take a story like this from CNN. Right? Let's take this here. copy that. A professional tone, a reading level of grade 12, and correct any grammar and spelling issues. And so you can take something that's perhaps was written for a 6th grade audience and upscale it. Right? You can change the language, you can move things up. And now if we put these two pieces of text side by side, that's not how we'll go away. So here's the rewritten text, and here's the original text. These are different. These are structurally different enough that a search engine is going to see this is separate content, different content, right? It is not it's not a copy paste. The plagiarism we've seen online so far has been really rudimentary, like swapping out one adjective for another, really clumsy. And you can tell very easily by reading it, oh, okay, I know exactly which blog this was cribbed from. Like when the folks over at Content Marketing Institute put out a new blog post, instantly in our social media mentions, our media monitoring tools, we get notifications of all the copycats that are taking that content, either republishing it as is or making, really, really awkward adjustments. This is going to change that game. Right? Mm-hmm. This is going to change that game to the point where it's now unique enough that it will pass muster.
So to the question of top news and web stories, if I were running CNN and I said, okay, I want 6 different versions of this story for different audiences, this would be a good use case for using something like OpenAI. I write the initial story with all the facts in it, and then I can put in this prompt to say, rewrite it for a reading level of grade 3, grade 6, grade 12, so on and so forth.
Exactly right.
Okay. So and then that helps me scale the amount of content that I'm then creating and putting out there. And because I'm a trusted news source, then I'm dominating the field in terms of the content that's going out.
Mm-hmm. Look what happened when I said make it grade 3 with a more casual tone. Mortgage rates have gone down again this week. It's the 4th week in a row that rates have dropped, right? It's a very, it is textually a very different tone, different content. So to your point, Katie, you can absolutely respin your existing content programmatically into very, very different formats, into very different ways of sound, sound that is still preserving the factual data, right? This article, these rewrites, all are still preserving the data correctly, but they're creating different variations. So yes, as a marketer, as a content creator, this offers you an incredible amount of potential. As an intellectual property defendant, this is kind of a nightmare scenario because the rewritten stuff, you can plausibly say, if it's based on facts and facts cannot be copyrighted, that somebody cribbed your work, respun it into something brand new, and it may do better than your content.
Well, on that happy note.
Yeah, I've seen more than one report that this is the end of the college and high school essays. Like, it's game over with this. It's going to destroy everything.
I was in one of my Discord servers the other day, and a friend was saying, I'm really stuck trying to write a paper about, write a 5-paragraph analysis of the artistic techniques of School of Athens by Raphael. Focus on the techniques and the cultural context. And they were like, I'm not really sure what to write. I'm supposed to, focus on, this or that. And I said, here, I copy paste out of OpenAI. I said, that's a starting point for your paper. There have been some interesting conversations, particularly on Reddit, of students whose grades are fantastic now because they have AI just generating their papers for them. and the teachers give the stamp approval. These pass plagiarism checks because they're original text. And so, yes, it is 100% the end of college essays, which raises the very valid question: what's the point, right? What is the point of having a student write an essay when a machine can write it better?
Well, I think that is a topic for another show and something for us to ponder.
It is, but I want you to think about that. What is the point of your content marketing, right? If a machine can generate better content than you, then what do you need to do to rise above what the machines are capable of? We've been saying now, and you can go onto the Trust Insights website or our YouTube channel, for the last 5 years, that the bar of competency keeps going up. 5 years ago, when we started Trust Insights, machine-generated language was pretty awful. It was word salad, right? And so even the drunk intern was going to do a better job. 3 years ago,
we don't have a drunk intern, for the record.
We don't even have a sober intern. 3 years ago, the GPT series came out, and suddenly machines could do okay, not great. GPT-2 came out, 2 years ago. Now the machines are starting to write reasonably well. And now with GPT-3 and 3.5, the machines are writing well. The machines are writing very well. And so the challenge for us as marketers and as creators is, what do we need to do to up-level our skills to stay ahead of the machines? Because as of right now, like with a college student writing a paper, the machine's going to do a better job, period.
Well, I think that, you've brought up a couple of things that we can cover on other podcasts and shows, including, recommendation engines, AI-powered recommendation engines, and what is the point of content marketing if AI can write it better? I think we can absolutely dig more into those topics at another time. So for today, in terms of your top news and web stories, it sounds like AI is definitely going to play a part in it. But if you're looking to just do general research, your SEO tools are pretty good. Something like a GDELT database is better, but know that it doesn't have a user-friendly interface. So be prepared to at least start doing some research on basic SQL commands. Those aren't very hard to put together, and they're pretty straightforward if you know what you're looking for, which, what's the question you're trying to answer before you start all of this. So Chris, final thoughts. John, final thoughts.
I'll let John go first.
Yeah. Cameo rates the articles, but only Google can say word up.
How are you going to top that, Chris?
I'm not.
All
I'm not
right.
going to even try it. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
For hours.
Until next week.
Thanks, folks. Bye. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.